What's up, everybody? This is the Highest Underground Show. I'm Chris Curls, and we are back reading the book, The Iron Curtain Over America by John Beatty. And we were at chapter 6 last time. It was the foreign policy of the Truman administration. And just to go ahead and refresh your memory a little bit, they were talking about the foreign policy of Truman in relation to Palestine and then China, and now they're going to be focusing on Germany. So let's just hop right in, and here we go. The Truman administration's third great mistake in foreign policy is found in its treatment of defeated Germany. In China and Palestine, Mr. Truman's State Department and executive staff henchmen can be directly charged with sabotaging the future of the United States. For despite the surrender at Yalta, the American position in those areas was still far from hopeless when Roosevelt died in April 1945. With regard to Germany, however, things were already about as bad as possible, and the Truman administration is to be blamed not for creating, but for tolerating and continuing a situation dangerous to the future security of the United States. At Yalta, the dying Roosevelt, with Hiss at his elbow and General Marshall in attendance, had consented to the brutality of letting the Soviet use millions of prisoners of war as slave laborers. 1 million of them still slaves or dead before their time. We not only thus agreed to the revival of human slavery in a form far crueler than ever seen in the Western world. Now think about that. He's saying that you're seeing a form of slavery that the Soviet Union did in the gulags that's far greater than anything in the Western world. And we talk about, the transatlantic slave trade and all of the cruelty that went on there. Well, most of the cruelty was done by the Africans to the Africans. If the Africans made it on the trek to the coast to get sold, honestly, the life that, even though they may have been a life of slavery, it would have been way better to be a slave in the Caribbean, and even better in the South. The South wasn't as cruel as the Caribbean. You see people in chains and, locked down working in chains. That was more in the Caribbean. That was never really in the South. All right. But I guess the Soviet slavery was far worse than far crueler than ever seen in the Western world. We also practiced the inhumanity of returning to the Soviet for Soviet punishment those Western-minded Russian soldiers who sought sanctuary in areas held by the troops of the once Christian West! Exclamation point. Now these are soldiers that decided to help us, and then after the war, we gave them back over to Russia, who was obviously going to kill them as traitors. So, we knew, and also the German soldiers that we allowed Russia to take, I think it was 1 million soldiers, these people never came home. These people were marching, going to their death. What we did to Germany after World War II was a disgrace. And we have karma to pay for it as a country, for sure. The Morgenthau Plan for reviving human slavery by its provision for forced labor outside Germany after the war was the basic document for these monstrous decisions. It seems that Roosevelt initiated this plan at Quebec without fully knowing what he was doing, and might have modified some of the more cruel provisions if he had lived and regained his strength. Instead, he drifted into the twilight, and at Yalta, Hiss and Marshall were in attendance upon him, while Assistant Secretary of State Atchison was busy in Washington. After Roosevelt's death, the same officials of sub-cabinet rank or high non-cabinet rank carried on their old policies and worked sedulously to foment more than the normal amount of post-war unrest in Western Germany. Still neglected was the sound strategic maxim that a war is fought to bring a defeated nation into the victor's orbit as a friend and ally. Indeed, with a much narrower world horizon than his predecessor, Mr. Truman was more easily put upon by the alien-minded officials around him. To all intents and purposes, he was soon their captive. So they're saying that he was more of a slave or a friend and ally to the Jews than his predecessors, to Roosevelt. From the point of view of the future relations of both Germans and Jews and of our own national interests, we made a grave mistake in using so many Jews in the administration of Germany. Since Jews were assumed not to have any, quote, Nazi contamination, end quote, the Jews who remained in Germany after the Nazi regime were available for use by military government. Also, many Jews who had come from Germany to this country during the war were sent back to Germany as American officials of rank and power. Some of these individuals were actually given on-the-spot commissions as officers in the Army of the United States. Unfortunately, not all refugee Jews were of admirable character. Some had been in trouble in Germany for grave, non-political offenses, and their repatriation in the dress of the United States officials was a shock to the German people. So basically, these people were criminals in Germany, migrated to the United States, and then came back to Germany in positions of power as officials. That's fucked up. There are testimonies of falsifications by Jewish interpreters and of acts of vengeance. The extent of such practices is not here estimated, but in any case, the employment of such large numbers of Jews, whether of good report or bad, was taken by Germans as proof of Hitler's contention, heard by many Americans as a shortwave song that America is a Jewish land and made rougher our road toward reconciliation and peace. A major indelible blot was thrown on the American shield by the Nuremberg war trials, in which, in clear violation of the spirit of our own Constitution, we tried people under ex post facto laws for actions performed in carrying out the orders of their superiors. Such a travesty of justice could have no other result than teaching the Germans, as the Palestine matter taught the Arabs, that our government had no sense of justice. The persisting bitterness from this foul fiasco is seen in the popular quip in Germany to the effect that in the Third World War, England will furnish the Navy, France the foot soldiers, America the airplanes, and Germany the war criminals. In addition to lacking the solid foundation of legal precedent, our war trials afforded a classic example of the law's delay. 7 German soldiers, ranging in rank from sergeant to general, were executed as late as June 7, 1951. Whatever these men and those executed before them may or may not have done, the long delay had 2 obvious results: 5 years of jobs for the U.S. bureaucrats involved, and a continuing irritation of the German people, an irritation desired by Zionists and communists, aka Jews. The Germans had been thoroughly alarmed and aroused against communism and used the phrase "against world communism" on placards and parade banners while Franklin Roosevelt was courting it. We need those votes. Consequently, the appointment of John J. McCloy as High Commissioner appeared as an affront, for this man was Assistant Secretary of War at the time of the implementation of the executive order, which abolishes rules designed to prevent the admission of communists to the War Department. And also, before a congressional committee appointed to investigate communism in the War Department, he testified that communism was not a decisive factor in granting or withholding an Army commission. Not only McCloy's record, but his manner in dealing with the Germans tended to encourage a permanent hostility toward America. Thus, as late as 1950, he was still issuing orders of them, or to them, not merely plainly, but bluntly and sharply. Volumes could not record all our follies in such matters as dismantling German plants for the Soviet Union while spending nearly $1 billion a year to supply food and other essentials to the German people, who could have supported themselves by work in the destroyed plants. For details on results from dismantling a few chemical plants in the Ruhr, see On the Record by Dorothy Thompson. Now, this is one of the things, so the German, sorry, I didn't realize I had that lamp there. The German factories were dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union so the Soviet Union could start making the chemicals, the metal factories, all the stuff that Germans were making. I mean, weapons manufacturers, they broke them down and shipped them all to the Soviet Union so the Soviet Union could basically, take over their businesses. The crowning failure of our policy, however, came in 1950. This is no place for a full discussion of our attitude toward the effort of 510,000 Jews, supported of course from the outside as shown in chapter 4 above, to ride herd on 62 million Germans, or the ghastly sequels. It appeared as sheer deception, however, to give the impression, as Mr. Atchison did, that we were doing what we could to secure the cooperation of Western Germany when Mr. Milton Katz was at the time our overall ambassador in Europe, and under the far from vigorous Marshall, the 2 top assistant secretaries of defense were the Eastern European Jewess, Mrs. Anna Rosenberg, and Mr. Marx Leva. Nothing is said or implied by the author against Mr. Katz, Mrs. Rosenberg, or Mr. Marx Leva, or others such as Mr. Max Lowenthal and Mr. Benjamin J. Butenweiser, who have been prominent figures in our recent dealings with Germany, the former as Assistant to Commissioner McCloy and the latter as Assistant High Commissioner of the United States. As far as the author knows, all 5 of these officials are true to their convictions. The sole point here stressed is the unsound policy of sending unwelcome people to a land whose goodwill we are seeking, or perhaps only pretending to seek. According to Forster's A Measure of Freedom, there is a steady growth of pro-German sentiment in the super-patriotic press in the United States. The contest suggests that Mr. Forster is referring in derision to certain pro-American sheets of small circulation, most of which do not carry advertising. These English-language papers with their strategically sound viewpoints can, however, have no appreciable circulation in Germany, if any at all, and Germans are forced to judge America by its actions and its personnel. In both, we have moved for the most part rather than to repel them, than to draw them into our orbit as friends. If we really wish friendship and peace with the German people and really want them on our side in case of another worldwide war, our choice of General Eisenhower as Commander-in-Chief in Europe was the most unfortunate. He is a tactful, genial man, but to the Germans he remains, now and in history, as the commander who directed the destruction of their cities with civilian casualties running as high as acclaimed 40,000 in a single night, and directed the U.S. retreat from the outskirts of Berlin. This retreat was both an affront to our victorious soldiers and a tragedy for Germany because of the millions of additional people it placed under the Soviet yoke. When they say that, he means that they retreated. Eisenhower retreated from Berlin and let Russia take over, and Russia was obviously controlled by Jews intent on destroying Germany. So, all right. So it was a affront to our victorious soldiers and a tragedy for Germany because of the millions of additional people it placed under the Soviet yoke, and because of the submarine construction plants, guided missile works, and other factories it presented to the Soviet. Moreover, General Eisenhower was supreme commander in Germany during the hideous atrocities perpetrated upon the German people by displaced persons after the surrender. There is testimony to General Eisenhower's lack of satisfaction with conditions in Germany in 1945, but he made, as far as the author knows, no strong gesture such as securing his assignment to another post. Finally, according to Mr. Henry Morgenthau, let me see here. Finally, according to Mr. Henry Morgenthau, General Eisenhower said, the whole German population is a synthetic paranoid, end of quote, and added that the best cure would be to let them stew in their own juice. All in all, sending General Eisenhower to persuade the West Germans to let bygones be bygones, even before the signing of a treaty of peace, was very much as if President Grant had sent General Sherman to Georgia to placate the Georgians 5 years after the burning of Atlanta and the march to the sea, except that the personable Eisenhower had the additional initial handicap of Mr. Katz breathing on his neck and Mrs. Anna Rosenberg in high place in the Department of Defense in Washington! Exclamation point. The handicap may well be insurmountable, for many Germans, whether rightly or not, believe Jews are responsible for all their woes. Thus, after the Eisenhower appointment, parading Germans took to writing on their placards not their old motto, the one against communism or whatever, but on mich, I don't know what that means, which may be translated, leave me out. In this Germany, whose deep war wounds were kept constantly festering by our policy, our government has stationed some 6 divisions of American troops. Why? In answering the question, remember that the Soviet Russia is next door, while our troops, supplies, and reinforcements have to cross the Atlantic. Moreover, if the Germans, fighting from and for their own homeland, failed with a magnificent army of 240 combat divisions to defeat Soviet Russia, what do we expect to accomplish with 6 divisions? Of course, in World War II, many of Germany's divisions were used on her west front, and America gave the Soviet $11 billion worth of war material. Still, by any comparison with the number of German divisions used against Stalin, 6 is a very small number for any military purpose envisioning victory. Can it be that the 6 divisions have been offered by some State Department schemer as World War III's European parallel to the sitting ducks at Pearl Harbor and the cockle shells in Philippine waters? According to the military historian historian and critic Major Hoffman Nickerson, our leaders have some, quote, undisclosed purpose of their own, or if they foresee war, they intend that war to begin either with a disaster or a helter-skelter retreat, end of quote. That was in the Freeman in July 2nd, 1951. In any case, the Soviet Union, whether from adverse internal conditions, rest of satellites, fear of our atomic bomb stockpile, confidence in the achievement of its objectives through diplomacy and infiltration, or other reasons, has not struck violently at our first bait of 6 divisions. But under our provocation, the Soviet has quietly got busy. For 5 years after the close of World War II, we maintained in Germany 2 divisions, and the Soviet leaders made little or no attempt to prepare the East German transportation network for possible war traffic. Rising, however, to the challenge of our 4 additional divisions, the Soviet took positive action. Here is the story from the AP dispatch from Berlin and Washington, the Time Herald. Quote, Russian engineers have started rebuilding the strategic rail and road system in Germany's Elbe River, East German sources disclosed today. The main rail lines linking East Germany and Poland with Russia are being double-tracked, the sources said. The engineers are rebuilding Germany's highways and bridge network to support tanks and other heavy artillery vehicles. End of quote. The Soviet got busy not only in transportation but in personnel and equipment. According to Drew Middleton, all 26 divisions of the Soviet group of armies in eastern Germany are being brought to full strength for the first time since 1946. Also, a stream of newly produced tanks, guns, trucks, and light weapons is flowing to divisional and army bases. There were reports also of the strengthening of satellite armies. These strategic moves followed our blatantly announced plans to increase our forces in Germany. Moreover, according to Woodrow Wyatt, British Undersecretary for War, the Soviet Union had under arms in the summer of 1951 215 divisions and more than 4 million men. Excuse me. Can it be possible that our State Department is seeking ground conflict with this vast force, not only on their frontier, but on the particular frontier which is closest to their factories and to their most productive farmlands? In summary, the situation of our troops in Germany is part of a complex world picture which is being changed daily by new world situations, such as our long delayed accord with Spain and a relaxing of the terms of our treaty with Italy. There are several unsolved factors. One of them is our dependence, at least in large part, on the French transportation network, which is in daily jeopardy of paralysis by the communists, who are numerically the strongest political party in France. Another is the nature of the peace treaty, which will someday be ratified by the government of West Germany and the Senate of the United States, and thereafter the manner of implementing that treaty. As we leave the subject, it can only be said that the situation of our troops in Germany is precarious, and that the question of our relations with Germany demands the thought of the blessed and the most patriotic people in America, a type not overly prominent in the higher echelons of our Department of State in recent years. All right, that was the end of that section on Germany. So, getting ready to part D now. Having by 3 colossal mistakes set the stage for possible disaster in the Far East, in the Middle East, and in Germany, we awaited the enemy's blow which could be expected to topple us to defeat. It came in the Far East. As at Pearl Harbor, the attack came on a Sunday morning, June 25th, 1950. On that day, North Korean communist troops crossed the 38th parallel from the Soviet zone to the recently abandoned U.S. zone in Korea and moved rapidly to the south. Our government knew from several sources about these communist troops before we moved our troops out on January 1st, 1949, leaving the South Koreans to their fate. For instance, in March 1947, Lieutenant General John R. Hodge, U.S. commander in Korea, stated that Chinese communist troops were participating in the training of a Korean army of 500,000 in Russian-held North Korea. Despite our knowledge of the armed might of the forces in North Korea, despite our vaunted failure to arm our former wards, the South Koreans, despite our hands-off statements placing Formosa and Korea outside our defense perimeter and generally giving communists the green light in the Far East, and despite President Truman's statement as late as May 4th, 1950, that there would be no shooting war, we threw United States troops from Japan into that unhappy peninsula without the authority of Congress to meet the communist invasion. Our troops from Japan had been trained for policy duty rather than as combat units and were without the proper weapons. This deplorable fact was confirmed officially by former Defense Secretary Lewis Johnson, who testified that our troops in Korea were not equipped with the things you would need if you were to fight a hostile enemy. They were staffed and equipped for occupation, not for war or an offensive. He gave this as a testimony before the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. Our administration had seen to it that those troops, which became our South Korean allies, were also virtually unarmed. For the Defense Department had no establishment for Korea. It was under the State Department at that time. All right. Under such circumstances, can any objective thinker avoid the conclusion that the manipulators of the United States policy confidently anticipated the defeat and destruction of our forces, which Secretary Acheson advised President Truman to commit to Korea in June 1950? But the leftist manipulators of the State Department, whether in that department or on the outside, were soon confronted by a miracle they had not foreseen. The halting of the North Korean communists by a handful of men under such handicaps was one of the remarkable and heroic pages in history, credit for which must be shared by our brave frontline fighting men, their field commanders, including Major General William F. Dean, who was captured by the enemy, and Lieutenant General Walton H. Walker, who died in Korea, and their Commander-in-Chief, General of the Army, Douglas MacArthur. The free world applauded what seemed to be a sudden reversal of our long policy to surrender to Soviet force in the Far East, and the United Nations gave its endorsement to our administration's venture in Korea. But the same free world was stunned when it realized the significance of our president's order to the U.S. 7th Fleet to take battle station between Formosa and the Chinese mainland and stop Chiang from harassing the mainland communists. Prior to the communist aggression in Korea, Chiang was dropping ammunition from airplanes to unsubdued nationalist troops, whose number by average estimates of competent authorities was placed at approximately 1,250,000. It was bombing communist concentrations, was making hit and run raids on communist-held ports, and was intercepting supplies which were being sent from Britain and the United States to the Chinese communists. Repeated statements by Britain and America that such shipments were of no use to the communist armies were demolished completely by Mr. Winston Churchill, who revealed on the floor of the House of Commons on May 7, 1951, that the material sent to the Chinese communists included 2,500 tons of Malayan rubber per month. Chiang's forces, despite frequent belittlings in certain newspapers and by certain radio commentators, were and are by no means negligible. His failure on the mainland had resulted directly from our withholding of ammunition and other supplies, but as shown above, he successfully covered his retreat to Formosa. According to Major General Claire Chennault of the famed Flying Tigers and Senator Nolan of California, a World War II major and member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, who investigated independently, Chiang late in 1950 had about 500,000 trained troops in Formosa and considerable material. The number was placed at 600,000 by General MacArthur in his historic address to the two houses of the Congress on April 19, 1951. Our action against Chiang had one effect, so obvious as to seem planned. By our order to the 7th Fleet, the communist armies which Chiang was pinning down were free to support the Chinese communist forces assembled on the Korean border to watch our operations. Despite our State Department's assumption that the Chinese communists would not fight, those armies seized the moment of their reinforcements from the south, which coincided with the extreme lengthening of our supply lines, and entered the war in November 1950, 13 days after the election of a pro-Acheson Democratic Congress. In his appearance before the combined Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees of the Senate in May 1951, General MacArthur testified that two Chinese Communist armies, which had been watching Chiang and had identified among our enemies in Korea, had been identified among our enemies in Korea. Thus, our policy in the Strait of Formosa was instrumental in precipitating the Chinese Communist attack upon us when victory in Korea was in our grasp. And basically what that means is he saw Chinese communists who we were supplying with ammunition and supplies fighting with the enemies in Korea that the United States was fighting. Of course we would do that. We've always done that. We've always been a corrupt nation almost since the first beginning. It didn't take very long for it to become corrupted. Here then, in summary, was the situation when the Chinese communists crossed the Yalu River in November 1950. We had virtually supplied them with the sinews of war by preventing Chiang's interference with their import of strategic materials. We had released at least 2 of their armies for an attack on us by stopping Chiang's attacks on them. We not only for political reasons had refused Chiang's offer of 33,000 of his best troops when the war broke out. Let me see here. When the war broke out, but even in the grave crisis in November 1950, we turned down General MacArthur's plea that he allowed to accept 60,000 of Chiang's troops. These truths, which cannot be questioned by anyone, constitute a second barrage of evidence that the shapers of our policy sought defeat rather than victory. Had General MacArthur been permitted to use them, Chiang's loyal Chinese troops would not only have fought communists, but being of the same race and speaking the same or a related language, would no doubt have been able to induce many surrenders among the Red Chinese forces. If we had accepted the services of Chiang's troops, we would have also secured the great diplomatic advantage of rendering absurd and probably preventing the outcry in India and possibly other Asiatic countries that our operation in India in Korea was a new phase of Western imperialism. But this was not all that our State Department and presidential coterie did to prevent the victory of troops in Korea. Despite the fact that the United Nations on October 7, 1950 voted by a big majority for crossing the 38th parallel to free North Korea up to the Yalu River, we denied MacArthur's army the right to use air reconnaissance for acquiring intelligence indications of the Chinese communist troops and facilities across that river. Now, why would we do that? Why would we deny a general access to air reconnaissance? I mean, it's just like the people running our government wanted us to lose. They wanted to kill white Christian soldiers. The amazing denial of a commander's elementary right to take a reasonable precaution in saving soldiers' lives at last made clear to many Americans that we were fighting for some other objective besides victory. Coming as it did as one of a series of pro-communist moves, this blindfolding of General MacArthur prompted Representative Joe Martin of Massachusetts, former Speaker of the House, to ask pointedly in his Lincoln Day speech, "What are we in Korea for? To win or to lose?" The denial of the right to reconnoiter and to bomb troop concentrations and facilities after whole Chinese armies were committed against us was very close to treason under the constitutional prohibition of giving aid and comfort to an enemy. In fact, if a refusal to let our troops take in defense of their lives measures always recognized in warfare is not only permissible but obligatory, does not constitute aid and comfort to the enemy, it is hard to conceive any action which might be so construed. The pretense that by abstaining from reconnaissance and from the bombing of enemy supply lines we kept the Soviet out of the war makes sense only to the very ignorant or to those in whose eyes our State Department can do no wrong. A country such as the Soviet Union will make war when the available material is adequate, when its troops have been trained and concentrated for the proposed campaign, and when the government decides that conditions at home and abroad are favorable, not when some of its many catspaws are bombed on one side or the other of an Asiatic river. The only logical conclusion, therefore, and a conclusion arrived at by a whole succession of proofs, is that for some reason certain people with influence in high places wanted heavier American casualties in Korea, the final defeat of our forces there, and the elimination of MacArthur from the American scene. But once again, MacArthur did not fail. Once again, under terrible odds, MacArthur first evaded and then stopped the enemy, and enemy sent against him by the Far Eastern policy of Truman and Acheson. According to General Bonner Fellers, the Chinese field commanders in Korea in the spring of 1951 were desperate and could not hold out much longer. Apparently not wanting victory, the Truman... Let me see here. Apparently not wanting victory, the Truman-Acheson-Marshall clique acted accordingly. On April 10, 1951, General Douglas MacArthur was dismissed from his Far Eastern Command. With MacArthur's successor, our top echelon executives took no chances. Before a Florida audience, the veteran radio commentator H.V. Kaltenborn spoke as follows, quote, "General Ridgway told me in answer to my query as to why we can't win that he was under orders not to win." End of quote. The frantic dismissal of a great general who is also a popular and successful ruler of an occupied country caused a furor all over America. The general was invited to address the two houses of the Congress in joint session and did so on April 19, 1951. During the same hour, the president conferred, as he said later, "Y'all, I'm sorry, my dog has kennel cough, and here we go." So I apologize if she starts hacking up here in a minute. During the same hour, the president conferred, as he said later, with Dean Acheson without turning on radio or television, and Mrs. Truman was at a horse race. General MacArthur's speech will forever be a classic in military annals and among American state papers. It was followed shortly by an investigation of the circumstances leading to his dismissal, an investigation by the combined Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees of the Senate. The millions of words of testimony before the combined Senate committees resulted in no action. The volume of questions and answers was so vast that few people or none could follow all of it, but certain good resulted. Even over and above the awakening of the more alert Americans to the dangers of entrusting vital decisions to men with mental processes of the Secretaries of State and Defense. After the MacArthur investigation, the American people knew more about our casualties in Korea and learned of the Defense Department's acceptance of the idea of a bloody stalemate. And they also got a shocking documentary proof of the ineptitude or virtual treason of our foreign policy. These three topics will be developed in the order here listed. All right, so they knew more about our casualties in Korea. And let's see, by May 1951, 11 months after the Korean Communist troops crossed the 38th parallel, our own publicly admitted battle casualties had reached the recorded total of 69,276, a figure much larger than that for our casualties during the whole first full year of World War II. On the subject of our casualties, Senator Bridges of New Hampshire, senior Republican member of the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, revealed that further significant fact that as of April 1951, Americans had suffered 94.6% of all casualties among the UN forces aiding South Korea. Parenthetically, the second United Nations member in the number of casualties in Korea was our Muslim co-belligerent, the Republic of Turkey. I didn't even know Turkey was helping us out in the Korean War. The casualties of South Korea were not considered in this connection since that unhappy land was not a UN member. Moreover, on May 24, 1951, General Bradley revealed in his testimony before the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate that non-battle casualties, including the loss of frozen legs and arms, which had not been included in lists issued to the public, totaled an additional 72,679 casualties, among them 612 dead. Now, take in note that a casualty is just an injury. It's not necessarily a death. So when they say these, they're talking about people who got shot, people who broke their leg, people who, any kind of injury that you could possibly sustain during combat. Now, with such terrible casualties admitted and published, President Truman's glib talk of avoiding war by police action in Korea appeared to more and more people to be nothing but quibbling with the heartless disregard of our dead and wounded men and their sorrowing relatives. Our battle casualties passed 100,000 by mid-November 1951. Before his dismissal, General MacArthur stressed his conviction that the only purpose of war is victory. In direct contrast, Secretary of Defense Marshall admitted to the Congress, in seeking more drastic draft legislation, that there was no foreseen end to our losses in Korea, a statement undoubtedly coordinated with the State Department. This acceptance of a bloody stalemate with no foreseeable end horrified MacArthur, who is a Christian as well as a strategist, and prompted a protest which was a probable factor in his dismissal. The Marshall strategy in Korea was summed up succinctly by U.S. News and World Report as a plan to bleed the Chinese into a mood to talk peace. This interpretation was confirmed by General Marshall, who was still Secretary of Defense, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee on May 7, 1951. What an appalling prospect for America. This fighting a war our leaders do not want us to win, for when every possible drop of our blood has been shed on Korean soil, the dent in China's 475 million people will not be noticeable. This is true because on a bloodletting basis, we cannot kill them as fast as their birth rate will replace them. Moreover, the death of Chinese communist soldiers will cause no significant ill effects on Chinese morale, for the Chinese communist authorities publish neither the names of the dead nor any statistics on their losses. Terrible for its full and final exposure of our government's wanton waste of young American lives and of State Department's destruction of our world position, but fortunate for its complete revelation of treason or the equivalent in high places in our government. A second installment of the Wedemeyer report was given to the public on May 1st, 1951, possibly because of the knowledge that the MacArthur Fuhrer would turn the daylight on it anyhow. The full text of the Wedemeyer report on Korea as issued was published in the New York Times for May 2nd, 1951. The report was condensed in an editorial which Congressman Walter H. Judd of Minnesota included in the Congressional Record. Here is a portion of the Daily News editorial with a significant passage from the Wedemeyer report. Quote, "The Wedemeyer reports, which presented plans to save China and Manchuria from communism, were suppressed until July 1949. The report on Korea was denied to the public until yesterday. It contained this warning. The Soviet-equipped and trained Northern Korean People's Communist Army of approximately 125,000 is vastly superior to the United States organized constabulary, I don't know this word, constabulary of 16,000 Koreans equipped with Japanese small arms. The withdrawal of American military forces from Korea would result in the occupation of South Korea either by Soviet troops or, it seems more likely, by the Korean military units trained under Soviet auspices. Those units," General Wedemeyer said, "maintained active liaison with the Chinese communists in Manchuria." This was written nearly 4 years ago. To meet this threat, General Wedemeyer recommended a native force on South Korea, sufficient in strength to cope with the threat from the north, to prevent the forcible establishment of a communist government. Since 70% of Korean population was in the American occupation zone south of the 38th parallel, the manpower advantage was in our favor if we had used it. But the sound Wedemeyer proposal was ignored, and when the predictive invasion began, American troops had to be rushed to the scene because sufficient South Korean troops were not available. The State Department was responsible for this decision." End of quote. Thus, a long-suppressed document full of warning and fulfilled prophecy joined the spilled blood of our soldiers in casting the shadow of treason upon our State Department. UN forces under present restraints will not be able to win, said U.S. News and World Report on June 8, 1951. In fact, by their government's plan, they were not allowed to win. Here's how the Freeman summed up our Korean War. Quote, "So whenever the Chinese communists feel they are getting the worst of it, they may simply withdraw, rest, recoup, rearm, and make another attack at any time most advantageous to themselves. They have the guarantee of Messengers Truman, Atchison, and Marshall that they will be allowed to do all this peacefully and at their leisure, that we will never pursue them into their own territory, never bomb their concentrations or military installations, and never peep too curiously with our air reconnaissance to see what they are up to." End of quote. It's kind of fucked up that we were, the Freeman, I don't know what, I'm going to have to look at this newspaper because they were printing some stuff in 1951 that was, ladling gravy and dropping some truth bombs, and I don't even know if they still exist, but they've probably been corrupted if they do still exist, but yeah, it sounded like a pretty cool little publication. All right. The Truce Conference between the Communists and the representatives of the American Far East Commander, General Matthew B. Ridgway, was protracted throughout the summer and autumn of 1951 and into April 1952, when General Mark Clark of Rapido River notoriety succeeded to the military command once held by Douglas MacArthur. Whatever its outcome may be under General Clark, this conference has so far had one obvious advantage for the communists. It has given them time in which to build up their resources and material, particularly in tanks and jet planes, and time to bring up more troops, an opportunity capable of turning the scales against us in Korea, since the corresponding heavy reinforcements of our troops was forbidden under our new policy of sending 4 divisions to Germany. The potential disaster inherent in our long executive dawdling, while our troops under the pliant Ridgway saw their air superiority fade away, should be investigated by Congress. and letters to public, and he can't invest. It's so funny because he's like, it should be investigated by Congress, but there's very few members in Congress at that time who were patriots and constitutionalists and willing to stand up for the country. There's practically none now. I mean, almost everybody in Congress now is corrupt, probably has, the Jews have blackmail on them, and especially Supreme Court Justice John Roberts. He's voting with the libtards now on certain issues, and I think that the Jews have something on it. Say the Jews, the globalists, the Zionists, not all Jews are in the cabal to control the world. But if you study the Talmud, then you're my enemy. All right. In letters to public officials and to the press, and in resolutions passed in public meetings, the American people should demand such an investigation. Congress should investigate the amount of pre-combat training given our flyers, the question of defective planes and crashes in the Strategic Air Command under General LeMay and others, as well as the decline under President Truman of our relative air strength in Korea and the world. For amazing pertinent facts, see Emergency in the Air by General Bonner Fellers. A peace treaty with Japan was proclaimed at San Francisco on September 8, 1951, after the dismissal of General MacArthur. This treaty ratified the crimes of Yalta, under which, in defiance of the Atlantic Charter and of every principle of self-interest and humanity, we handed to the Soviet the Kuril Islands and placed Japan perilously in the perimeter of Soviet power. Moreover, the preamble to the treaty provides that Japan shall strive to realize the objectives of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Since this declaration is intended to supersede the U.S. Constitution, the Senate's ratification of the treaty is thought by many astute political observers to foreshadow UN meddling within our boundaries and other violations of our sovereignty. This is probably, right now, I bet the UN controls a lot in our country and we don't even realize it. On April 28, 1952, Japan, amid a clamor of Soviet denunciation, became a nation again. At best, the new Japan, sorely overpopulated and underprovided with food and other resources, could not for many years be other than a source of grave concern to our country. This is our legacy from Hiss, Atchison, and Dulles. And what of the South Koreans, a people we are ostensibly helping? Their land is a bloody shambles, and 3 million of them are dead. It was thus that we joined Britain in, quote, helping, end quote, Poland in World War II. The best comment is a haunting phrase of the Roman historian Publius Cornelius Tacitus, when he says, "Where they create a wasteland, they call it peace." Thus, with no visible outcome but a continuing bloody stalemate and continuing tragedy for the South Koreans, more and more clean young Americans are buried under white crosses in Korea. Perhaps the best summary of our position in Korea was given by Earl Koch Jr., National Commander of the American Legion, after a tour of the battle lines in Korea. And he says, quote, "Our present-day Benedict Arnolds may glibly argue that it is necessary to keep Chiang and his armies blockaded on Formosa, but these arguments make no sense to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who have to do the fighting and dying. They see in Chiang's vast army a way of saving some of the 250 lives that are being needlessly sacrificed each week because certain furtive people expound that Chiang isn't the right sort of person, and therefore we cannot accept his aid. Our fighting men are not impressed by these false prophets because they haven't forgotten that these same people not long ago were lauding Mao's murdering hordes as, quote, agrarian reformers, end of quote. For the life of them, and life is meant in a very literal sense, they can't understand why our State Department and the United Nations make it necessary for them to be slaughtered by red armies which swarm down on them from territory which our own heads of government make sacrosanct. Agents of the Kremlin sitting in the councils of the United Nations in Washington and elsewhere must laugh up their sleeves at our utter idiocy. But you may be sure that our GIs are not amused. They see the pictures as clearly as the Soviet agents do, but unlike our stateside leaders, they see the results of this criminal skullduggery in the blood they shed and in the mangled corpses of their buddies. What they cannot understand, though, is the strange apathy of the people back home. As they listen to radio reports of what is happening thousands of miles to the east of them, they are puzzled. Isn't the American public aware of what's going on? Don't they realize that their sons and husbands and sweethearts are fighting a ruthless enemy who has them at a terrible disadvantage thanks to a stupid or traitorous advisors and inept diplomacy? End of quote. This brings us to Delegate Warren Austin's statement that the UN votes with us usually 53-5, but runs out on us when the question rises of substantial help in Korea. The reader is now ready for and has probably arrived at the truth. The free nations vote with us because we are obviously preferable to the Soviet Union as a friend or ally, but the Soviet Union absorbs and destroys its allies. But according to the Lebanon delegate to the United Nations quoted above, the nations of Asia are withholding their full support of U.S. policy because they are pained and bewildered by it. They do not understand a foreign policy which A, applauds the landing of Russian-trained troops on a Palestine beachhead and amiably tolerates the bloody liquidations of natives and UN officials, and B, goes to war because one faction of Koreans is fighting another faction of Koreans in Korea. The failure to see any sense of United States policy is not confined to the nations of Asia. In France, our oldest friend among the great powers, there is confusion also. There is a full-page cartoon in the conservative and dignified L'Illustration showed Stalin and Truman sitting over a chessboard. Stalin is gathering in chessmen, U.S. soldiers' lives, while Truman looks away from the main game to fumble with the deck of cards. Stalin asks him, "Finally, my friend, won't you tell me exactly what game we are playing?" This quip should touch Americans to the quick. Exactly what game are we playing? How can Lebanon or France or any nation or anybody understand a policy which fights communism on the 38th parallel and helps it in the Strait of Formosa, which worships aggression in Palestine and condemns it in Korea? In the Philadelphia Inquirer, the matter was brilliantly summed up in the headline of a dispatch from Ivan H. Peterman, U.S. zigzag diplomacy baffles friend and foe. Meanwhile, amid smirking complacency in the State Department, more and more of these young men who should be the Americans of the future are buried beneath white crosses on an endless panorama of heartbreak ridges. You know, this is the end of the chapter, y'all. I really didn't know how bad Korea was. I mean, I know that most of the wars that are fought, I mean, even since the Civil War, besides the Revolutionary War, no one has ever fought for our freedom. No soldier alive who's been alive in 100 years. But it sounds like we really set our people up in Korea, and a lot of people will know, you will know maybe someone who fought in Korea or Vietnam. This is a lot more closer than, because all the World War veterans are dying out, and most of them have died out by now, I think, or will be soon. But y'all, that was the end of chapter 6. The foreign policy of the Truman administration. Next up in chapter 7, which we will start in the next couple of days, does the National Democratic Party want war? Thank you for listening, and I'll be back soon. Peace.